Great to see you all. It is my pleasure to be here today. What a great morning here. Just a quick word of introduction. My name is Shankar Chandran. I run one of Samsung's venture capital funds. I'm based right here in the Bay Area. To perhaps kick it off, before I talk about data as a new oil and investing in data companies, a little bit of orientation. Let me talk about where I sit in Samsung, if this would work. Okay, I'll keep going. No worries. I'll keep going. So Samsung, most of you are familiar with Samsung as a company. What you may not know is the company is one of the largest tech companies by revenue. Last year, we were over 200 billion in revenue. In fact, there's only two companies north of 200 billion in revenue. And we have three large business groups. Our mobile group does our smartphones. Our consumer electronics group does our smart TVs and home appliances. And our device solutions does our semiconductors and display technology, which, if it was an independent company, will be the world's largest semiconductor company. So it's a really successful company. I sit on the right side here, the orange box. It is the Chief Strategy Officer office led by Young Sohn, who is President and Chief Strategy Officer of the company. The unique thing about this company is the Chief Strategy Officer sits here in Silicon Valley. The future of the company is really thought through about from here because this is the confluence of tech and commerce, and we see that by being here, we really think about how Samsung's going to grow over the next 20 years. There are three key objectives of the Chief Strategy Officer. One is to create new businesses for Samsung. Now, when you're that big, that is really hard. You have to find great new big markets to go after. And the way we think about building new businesses for Samsung is to do them inorganically. And a good example is last year, Samsung acquired Harman International, which is a pretty large company, $8 billion in revenue. They make money both in the automotive space as well as in consumer electronics. That was done out of here in Silicon Valley. So that's a good example, and we're thinking about doing that more in other areas where data has a very strong play. The other two parts of the Chief Strategy Officer's job is to think about building open platforms and also venture capital investments, and that's where I come in. I'm the head of Samsung Catalyst Fund, which is a $500 million fund. We are a multi-stage fund. We do very early stage all the way to growth equity. It's a global effort. We have critical mass here in Silicon Valley. We have a team in Israel and a team in Europe, and that covers about 90% of what we do. So having said that and getting that out of the way, let me jump a little bit into the way I see the world out there. So first, before I talk about data, some big numbers. So there are 100 billion stars out there, and that's an interesting and very, very large number. And coincidentally, it turns out that there's 100 billion neurons in the human brain as well. But just in terms of scale, the number of IP addresses that are possible is an incredibly large number. It's 340 trillion IP addresses. So if you have something with you, an object that is not connected today, it will be connected in the future. Almost everything's going to be connected. And guess what? Any object that is connected onto the internet is going to be streaming data. And you're going to have a massive explosion of data. In fact, the massive explosion of data is happening today. And I'm not sure if you guys know what a zettabyte is. How many zeros in a zettabyte? Any guesses? It's 21 zeros. It's a really large number. So today, we are north of 20 zettabytes of data. By 2025, you're going to see 160 zettabytes of data being generated. And it's really because everything is getting connected. So that's what is happening around us. But the problem with this data is only a very small percentage of this data is really analyzed because it is just not possible to clean up the data the way it's produced today. And it is not possible to analyze this really large volume of data. And therein lies the challenge. So how much is that 160 zettabytes? So if you were to watch 2.5 billion hours of 4K UHD, it's 160 zettabytes. Or a Samsung Galaxy phone has about 128 gigabytes of memory and that storage. That's 12 trillion of these phones, and if you stack them up, it's all the way to the moon and back. So that's the kind of data that we are talking about. So how do we really make sense out of this? I'm a bit of a history buff. I always look to history in thinking about where else did we see this before. And I think if you go back 100 years or so, for the last 100 years, we've really been living in the oil economy. And if you think about that, it turns out oil really was not discovered just 100 years ago. In fact, people have known about oil for easily over a couple of thousand years. In fact, being a history buff, I can tell you a couple of thousand years ago, the streets of Baghdad had coal tar on the streets, and they used oil to keep the roads down and keep them surfaced. The Chinese burnt oil in their lamps. So oil's been around for a long time, but it wasn't until about 100 years ago with the invention of the internal combustion engine that everything changed. So you finally had a mechanism, a machine that would burn oil quite efficiently and produce energy. It brought people together. It enabled commerce. And you basically had about 100 years of history where the value chain for the oil economy built out. And you basically had everything dependent on the supply of oil in terms of building out the economy. So why are we talking about this interesting historical anecdote? I think there is a ton of things to learn about this when you think about the data economy. So data is not new. In fact, big data and small data has been talked about in Silicon Valley for a very, very long time. So we've all been talking about this. But what is new about data in the last few years is, if you stick with the internal combustion engine analogy, in the last few years, we finally had a mechanism to process massive quantity of data. You've basically had great advancements in machine learning, artificial intelligence, deep learning, et cetera, that's fundamentally changed the way data can be processed and data could be understood and new insights could be gotten. And that is really what is happening around us today. And we think that just like it took a while for the oil value chain to get built out and for that to really dictate the future, we think the data economy is really just come in, and it's because of what has happened in the last few years. So in fact, if you go back just 10 years ago, 2007, the top 10 companies by market cap, 7 of these companies, if you look at them closely, are oil companies. In fact, well, maybe not, maybe 4, and then you got some financial institutions. You got 1 tech company. Number 3 was a tech company. How does it look like today? You've got 7 companies in the top 10 market cap that are data-oriented tech companies. So the world has completely changed. You basically have 1 oil company up there. So think about that a little bit. So when did this crossover happen? Just a few years ago, 2014, 2013. If you just total up the top 5 companies by market cap, the data companies have continued to grow. Today, the value there is about $3 trillion, while the oil companies, despite the gyrations in oil prices, have largely remained the same. Basically, the oil economy has largely been the same, but where you see the inflection point, the rate of change, is really around where the data economy has kicked in. So what does it mean in terms of how do we invest, how do we think about the data economy? We think that there is a convergence of 5 major factors that have come together. We already talked about the hyper-connected world. Everything is connected. We talked about the massive amount of data and huge improvements in AI. But you combine that with a couple of really big challenges. It used to be Silicon Valley 40 years ago was really kicked off by the invention of the transistor, the solid-state transistor. And it turns out the one driving force of that was Moore's Law, where you could build a device that was twice as fast or half the cost every 18 months. Moore's Law doesn't work anymore. It turns out that compute paradigms have to fundamentally change in order to do new ways of computing at this point because you can no longer keep up with the scaling down of transistors. It also turns out that in the last few years, I think each of us here are quite intimately familiar with episodes like Equifax, et cetera, where you've had cybersecurity threats. Data is no longer safe. And you got this huge confluence of data and privacy issues that fundamentally matter. So we think that we are in a perfect storm scenario, and investors like me really like the idea of convergence of many of these things coming together because this is where we find the opportunities. These are the problems that startups tend to solve. So that's where we're really investing. And if you think about a few of the areas, a few verticals where we think this convergence is happening, IoT, which is connected devices, digital health, as well as ADAS. ADAS for us is advanced driver assistance systems. Some people call it autonomous driving, others call it safety systems in cars. We think that these are the three verticals where data fundamentally matters, and this is where we've been making a lot of investments in the last few years. So let me give some examples. So we're really proud investors in a company called Ring, and I don't know, do you guys know about Ring? So very interesting company. So people think of Ring as a smart doorbell. So what's the big deal with a smart doorbell, right? So it all comes down to data and insight. When I met with a company several years ago and on behalf of Samsung invested in them, the company told me this great narrative. They had this great insight, which is they found out that almost over 90% of the cases where a burglary happens, it usually happens after somebody rings the doorbell, because the burglar does not want to get put away for a home invasion, right? In case they do get caught, they want to put away for a burglary. So they realized this was a really fundamental insight, and the data was really important. So they created the smart doorbell where the user, the homeowner, could be anywhere in the world, and anybody in front of their doorbell rings the bell, and they can answer the door and talk back. And they have countless videos of unsavory characters showing up at the doorbell, hearing a voice, turning around and leaving. So they actually prevent crime. And so it turns out it's not the old paradigm of someone calling 911 when there's a break-in. This is a case of using data to prevent crime. And today they are ringing neighborhoods. There are entire neighborhoods where the number of break-ins have just plummeted because of the way these guys have done it. So I think of Ring as a data company. It's not a smart doorbell company. So it's really about what kind of data can you create, how could you use the data to make people's lives better, and then how can you build a business behind that? So that's the kind of ideas that we're thinking about. In the years past, a hardware company would have just created a nice little doorbell and nothing else would have happened. But this is a fundamentally new way of thinking about how companies are getting built. I'll spend a minute on this as well. I talked about digital health. The way we think about health care is today we see that there is this great virtuous cycle of technology and life sciences influencing each other. In fact, in the years past, even in Silicon Valley, no one from the tech world would ever talk to anybody in the life sciences world. Turns out that it's really converging today. What does that mean? For example, deep learning. Deep learning, which I talked about recently, is really being influenced by the way the brain is, the brain mechanisms of hierarchical thinking and making perceptions work. So it really influenced the way deep learning algorithms were first written 4 or 5 years ago. And guess what? Now you got artificial intelligence and big data analytics looking at solving life sciences problems. For example, the cost of human genome today is about $1,000. So just a few years ago, it was millions of dollars. It's really about applying technology to get there. We believe that in a few years, in the next 4 or 5 years, you're going to have the genome down to $10. So that's a faster drop than Moore's Law. So we think that what's going to happen is every child being born, you're going to have the complete genome. And this is about using the data to fundamentally change the way healthcare is going to be delivered in our lifetimes. So we love this synergy, we love this area, and we've made a lot of investments in this area as well. Last area around smart cars And someone recently told me they think of a car as a computer on wheels. If you think about a Tesla, right? You got a battery, it's really a computer on wheels. But I think a car is really a data center on wheels. If you think about today's cars, they typically generate about 500 gigabytes of data. We think once you give the cars eyes and ears, we're talking about LiDARs and radars and equipment that allows the car to see what's in front of it and drive the car where you can actually drive it without any accidents. That we're going to get to a point where the car's going to be generating 50 terabytes of data a day. And there is no way you're going to be able to transfer all this data up to the cloud and do processing out there. So we think that every car is going to be a data center. So we think this is going to be one of those really big drivers of data consumption as well as new paradigms. So a few years ago, we said, okay, let's go think about this. Let's find startups. Let's find the world's greatest startups. Let's invest in them. Let's really learn about what's happening here. And we made about 14, 15 investments over a period of a couple of years. And it's all about thinking, how is data going to get used in a car? And these are some of the companies that we invested in. And the reason why I talk about this as an example is because it really helped Samsung, which has really no play in the automotive space. We're really a phone company and a semiconductor company, to learn about what is happening in the space. And as we did that, we realized that there are some fundamental shifts happening here. We really have to think about how do we play in this new market. And that led to our acquisition of Harman. By making investments in startups, by collaborating with them, by really understanding what is going on there, we had the confidence and the IQ to go make a pretty big investment and a purchase of a company. Today, we actually have an existing automotive business. And this picture here is what we showed at CES this year, about a year after the acquisition. This is a Maserati where tons of different Samsung technologies, including semiconductors and displays, have been built into the car. And this was one of the highly acclaimed cars that we were able to show at CES. So it kind of tells us how, when you go back the years, everyone here probably remembers the experience, the first time you switched from a flip phone to a smartphone. The user interface completely changed. And that's going to happen in a car over the next few years. And we think that by investing in startups and making some pretty big moves like the purchase of Harman, we've been able to contribute towards that change. So back to talking a little bit about where we invest. So really two broad areas. We think about our existing businesses, our smartphone business, our consumer electronics and semiconductors. We continue to invest there in startups that are coming up with some great innovation. At the same time, we think about the new data economy. And roughly half the investments that we do are for existing businesses. The other half is on the new data economy. Last year, Samsung was among the top 3 corporate investors. We invested over $200 million within the calendar year, over 75 companies, and we invested globally. We think that by doing this, we think startups are really the key lifeblood of innovation, and they're going to be the most disruptive. And a big company like us, we really can't do this alone. The only way we can do this is by investing in startups, learning and collaborating with them, and then figuring out a way, how do we do this together? So this is just a graphics of several of the companies that we invested in, and we're really proud of all these companies. Every one of these companies we feel has a potential to succeed, and they're working very closely with Samsung. So whenever you see a Samsung announcement of a new product, some of these companies are actually involved with those announcements that we're able to do. So finally, I think as I look to the future, we do live in a challenging time, geopolitics, cybersecurity threats, et cetera, but we think that data is going to be fundamentally useful. It's going to be the way by which we're going to be able to understand and solve some pretty large problems. And I think a company like Samsung, we really can't do this alone. This is why I'm here today to talk to startups. My team is here as well. We would love to find more ways by which companies like you can work with the world's biggest platform, which is Samsung. Thank you, guys.